This video is about making problems a process. Now, what I mean by this is for transformative psychotherapy, many times we have to move out of the realm of problem focused ideology. And a lot of times we spend our focus on client emotional, affective, and cognition aspects of the problem. And sometimes that's fine. But a lot of times we will tend to ignore kind of what's right in front of us in order to make change. People come to therapy sometimes and they a lot of times have identified with their problem. For example, they're depressed and they may have taken on depression as a subset of their personality in a way. That's they've been suffering for so long, it's almost like that's who they've become. I mean, just the utterance of I am blank says, unconsciously that's who we are. I am depressed. I am anxious. All those kind of things. And a lot of times when we get our personality invested in a problem, it's hard for us to just totally take that problem away if so much of who they feel they are is wrapped up into it. So rather than trying to fight against symptoms and eradicate symptoms, which I spoke about in a different video on Secret to Healing, I think maybe we could spend a little more time on what is observable and work from that area. And this is what I mean. Let's say somebody comes in who has an anxiety issue. They get very anxious, either about a situation or anxiety in general. Rather than trying to find where this originates from or trying to eradicate the anxiety, maybe what we need to do is just spend our first session figuring out how do they do this. What's the process for this? If we're watching them have this problem, what would we be seeing? What are the patterns that we're observing about the problem? Because we can spend all day and all week and all month and all year on the root cause or working real hard to try and eradicate the problem. So sometimes it might be good to just say, what are you doing? Now, when you're having this problem, where are you? What's happening to you physically? When does it start? When does it end? I mean, really go into detail, full psychological assessment of how the problem is constructed. Depression, viewed as a process, is much different than depression viewed as a way of being. So depression is doing rather than being. So how does someone do depression? Now certainly there are catalysts in our social networks and interactions that may be tied to this, but at the same time, this person's usually doing some aspect of what we call depression. So it may be they're starting to isolate themselves. So if they say, well, I'm not interacting much, right there's something we can directly deal with. How can we get the person to stimulate interaction again? Maybe they say, well, I'm spending more time, doing activities that aren't healthy for me. Well, those activities are things we can observe and then maybe change kind of the process. If somebody's anxious, they have a certain way that they feel about things due to some possible external circumstance. So they are generally in the mindset, this causes anxiety. So if we just move away from a linear this equals that and say, well, what else is going on? As in, if this situation is what makes you anxious, how are you doing anxiety? How are you holding your body? How are you, positioning yourself? How is your breathing? All those kind of things. To kind of almost to disassociate, if I can use that term a little bit, the person from the problem. And say, this is just a process you're doing, your body's doing, your mind's doing, however you want to phrase it. It's not who you are. And then once we learn the process, I want you to think of this as a recipe. This person has a recipe on how they do certain things that is unique to them. And it's nothing wrong with it until it's a bad recipe. So if somebody's depressed, they may have a recipe of how they create depression. If they're anxious, they may have a recipe of how they create anxiety. Even more severely, borderline personality disorders. There are processes to this. This isn't all just at the emotional level. They do things. So what is it that we can observe and look at this recipe? This recipe, then, maybe we should make some small alterations. Because small alterations in a recipe can have pretty substantial consequences. Let's give me an example of thinking about a recipe like cake, chocolate cake. My Achilles heel, by the way. I love it. Chocolate cake is fantastic when the right ingredients are used, with the right amount of those ingredients. So, for example, you have to have sugar to make chocolate cake. And since I don't cook, I'm just going to assume, let's just say 1 cup of sugar. Well, if you make put 1 cup of sugar in the cake will come out really wonderful. But let's say you only put 1/4 of a cup. It's going to change the recipe. Now, granted, it's still kind of chocolate cake, but something isn't quite right. But maybe we could add more sugar to it. Instead of 1 cup, let's add 6 cups of sugar. Now, I'm sure someone out there will like it, but for most of us, that's too much. Eggs, we could just maybe not put eggs in, cook everything without the eggs, or change the flour. So what I'm saying is that whatever this person is doing, if we treat this as a process, as a recipe, then we can alter little things in the recipe, in the process, to disrupt this process. So, for example, if someone is feeling anxious, I'll give you an example. I had a lady who, anytime she would hear something health related on television or read something about medicine, she would go into this obsessive thought pattern that would lead to a compulsion that she had to go knock, I think 7 times. To alleviate the anxiety. So the obsession thinking would just crash into her consciousness. Oh, you're going to be sick, you're going to die, whatever it was. And the intensity would grow, and only the knocking would kind of bring it down just a little bit. And unfortunately, very temporarily, because the next thing it would do that. So her recipe was pretty clear. Hearing this information, triggering this thought that just comes in on her, that overwhelms her, and then unable to dispute it in time before here comes this, and then she had to knock. Now, this was very embarrassing to her when she was at work or something like that. She had to go find a way to do it real quick and hide it. So what I asked her to do was, with a lot of coaxing and charm and persuasion, was to continue knocking. But between every knock, she had to do a small jumping jack. So she would knock, jumping jack, knock, jumping jack, knock, jumping jack, knock, for 7 times, so there'd be 7 jumping jacks. Now, she had this issue throughout the day, and so she would have to go off and do her knocks with the jumping jacks. So what we're doing there is interrupting the pattern. We're not fighting against the pattern. We're not going, well, don't knock, because I know that's not going to happen. But by adding something into that process, something interesting began to happen. It's almost like after a few days of this, her brain started realizing she had a little bit of space, a little bit of wiggle room to kind of open up to new behaviors, to little alterations in what she was doing. So after a few days, she noticed that now 7 became 5, and 5 became 3. And then by the time in 2 weeks when I saw her later, I think she was doing like 1 or 2 knocks. She still felt the need to do the 1 or 2 knocks, but it had decreased substantially. So granted, some of that's still there, but that's a pretty good outcome. And all we did is really focus on what am I observing? What is your recipe? What is your process? And again, going back to things like depression, if it's isolation, if it's personal neglect, if it's all these behavioral things that we can observe, that gives us a tremendous amount of resources to adjust those patterns. So, for example, if someone says they just can't bring themselves to get out of bed in the morning. I remember Dr. Erickson had a client, Milton Erickson had a client who had trouble getting out of bed in the morning, and I think he insisted that they agree to drinking, like 3 or 4 cups of water at bedtime. So they had to get up, So it's just little ways to interrupt patterns that can make changes. Erickson also sent a man who was depressed all the time and was at home depressed and couldn't get out of his depression, and told him that he needed to go to the library. Because if he was going to be depressed at home, he might as well go to the library. But what that ended up doing after a few days, he started interacting with other people, made some friends there, started reading things that stimulated his brain, and kind of moved him a little more to the process toward getting out of this limiting process that he was doing. So to sum up, it comes down to let's just not always focus so much on the person's emotional, the client's emotional state, although we need to attend to that. The client's cognition, although we need to attend to that. But let's sometimes focus a little bit of our energy on what they're doing and treating this as a process. So when somebody brings this horrible problem to you and you feel a little overwhelmed, remember, this is a process that he or she or they are doing. And they're giving you a recipe. So if you ask enough quality questions, you get a recipe that then you can maybe add a little sugar to. Have fun with it.